All right, and we're live. We're live, guys. Welcome to another episode of Good Morning Liberty. Hello over to Justin and Steve Smith out in the chat. I know you guys were here for my first effort on this morning. I was literally just thinking to myself, as an amateur at this, I learn as I go. I was just thinking, man, I am lucky that I have not had any real technical issues as I've done these live streams here on YouTube. And of course, today I hit I do go through a test as I do this a few minutes before running the show, make sure everything's working, the camera's set up, the audio's working. And of course, soon as I hit switched from the countdown screen to my camera, the connection between this Blackmagic Design input device and my computer went kaput. So a quick, what us pros do, we restart the computer and restart the stream. So hi to everybody. Yeah, EHP training. Maybe it was the Russians. I would think NSA more than anybody. Scouts Jack. Hello to you guys. I really appreciate you being here. Happy Friday, 9:30-ish a.m. here on the West Coast. And we got some interesting stuff to talk about today. I really want to focus on the big spending that's been happening. And I know that a lot of people were talking about the spending bill over at that just passed the Senate this week. But there was a report that Mike Meharry did that covered the spending that was happening before that even passed. So that's, I think, is going to be really interesting. Of course, we've got the ignorant comment of the week. It's Friday. That's going to be a fun one, and it will tie into this spending by both Democrats and Republicans. Steve points out, not to beat a dead horse, but every time I went back to... so for those of you who don't know, Steve Smith had stopped by, I think, one of our recent videos, one of the Washington videos, to try to like it, and he had mentioned in the comments that when he hit like and he stopped by and left a comment later, or maybe watched the rest of it, something like that, and the like was not liked, so it wasn't saving the like. So try it out for yourself. Go watch the very short video I put up recently, and after, okay. So maybe we're having some problems. So, but that's the reminder. Try it again. Smash that like button here today. Hopefully YouTube will record that and start showing the video to more and more people. It is increasing in viewership slowly but surely, so I really appreciate that. I'm very grateful for the comments, whether they're here live or later on in the archive. So I'm very grateful for that. And anytime you want to send an email, feel free to shoot one over to team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Either myself or someone else gets back. Not always very quickly. We're a little slow on email, but feel free to send something over. We read them all, and we reply when we can. So let's get into today's news stories that I want to cover. First of all, there's a report here from Mike Meharry, who's the National Communications Director for us at the 10th Amendment Center. He also works as a writer and a podcaster for Peter Schiff at schiffgold.com. So he is really, it's fascinating because when I first met Mike, I think he's with us now 8 or 9 years. And when I first met him, he was not really comfortable with issues of sound money, the Federal Reserve. Now he's actually running the weekly podcast for Schiff Gold. So he really has become an expert for himself. He's been self-taught, and he's really good on the economy, at least understanding how things play out. So he did this interesting report that we got through a tweet from Schiff, who noted that the Fed set a new spending record in August. I think it's a new August spending record. So the title we have here, Fed set new spending record in August. The swamp is overflowing. And here's how Mike put it. Donald Trump promised to drain the swamp, but as Peter Schiff put it, the swamp is now bigger and more expensive than ever. Republicans tout themselves as the party of fiscal responsibility, but the Trump administration has managed to outspend every one of his Democratic Party predecessors and all the previous Republicans, too. In August, the government spent a record $433.3 billion in a single month. $433.3 billion. Now, if you take that out to a month-by-month basis, that would be about $5 trillion a year. It's an incredible amount for a single month. It also came in 30% higher than August 2017 and was the highest outlay on record. Just an insane amount of spending. Now, mind you, in the run-up to the 2016 elections, we hear this today. we point out, stick to the Constitution, don't spend money on all these programs. Most of them are unconstitutional in the first place, et cetera, et cetera. And the response that we get from partisan hacks is, what, do you love Hillary instead? Or all you need to do is elect Republicans and everything will be fixed. Hopefully, less and less people are believing that lie, because whether it's Donald Trump or it's Paul Ryan or whoever, these are big, big spenders. George Bush was a big spender when he and people like Rick Santorum were running the show in Washington. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. As long as people keep turning a blind eye to this and saying, well, it's okay because my guy did it or my team did it, then it's only going to get worse. So we've got a real problem on spending here. And as we note, I talked about George Washington's farewell address, which the anniversary was on Wednesday. So I talked about it in the last show, and I didn't really get into it heavily. But he talked about cherishing the public credit. Use it as sparingly as possible, because if you want liberty and security, you can't just go into heavy debt. That means you're indebted to somebody or some special interest. So Washington said, don't spend like this. Certainly Jefferson also felt that if you spent more than what could be paid by the current generation, you were swindling people on a grand scale. So 30% higher than last year. It's not that it was... So sometimes what I've seen happen when you have a team power switch in Washington is that the current trajectory keeps going, and then maybe it can shift. Maybe. So this wouldn't necessarily fit that, because the growth went up in 2017 over 2016, and now that the Republicans are entrenched, it's even higher. And this was before the newest spending bill came in. So they spent $32 billion just paying interest on its current debt last month. It put down $108 billion for Social Security, also unconstitutional. $65 billion bombing foreign countries. I mean, for defense is how Mike put it. $83 billion on Medicare, and $146 billion on all other government agencies and programs, most of which shouldn't exist. Justin says, well, technically, since the public owns the majority of our debt, they have socialized monetary risk of the government. Yes, and that is even more dangerous, and I think Washington really kind of touched on that. If the government is going to spend so crazy like this, it is dangerous not only to liberty but security as well. So they have to crack down on people. So the liberty goes away. The IRS exists, the Federal Reserve, to pay for all this garbage. And they destroy our liberty by paying for all this junk and socializing it. And we're going to get into some talk about socialism. Ron Paul had a really good article earlier this week. And Mike goes on and he says, some people will read this and think, ho hum, who cares? And some people do. After all, people have been talking about runaway spending, budget deficits, and the federal debt for years. And nothing horrible has happened to them. But remember, we've also been in an artificially low interest rate environment for years. They're piling up debt and deficit. Interest rates are slowly coming up, and it's totally unsustainable. So we're in a very dangerous situation with the economy. It's worse than Obama, and Obama was the worst. I don't think anyone would disagree with the idea that this guy was incredibly bad when it came to spending and civil liberties and liberty and rights and the power of government, and the spending has gone way up since then. Now, it's not just Mike Meharry and Schiff Gold that's talking about this. Even on the left, you get some people that are complaining about what's happening, not necessarily for the social programs. So back when I used to be an anti-war activist before, so I started out doing just anti-war activism in the streets with the communists. And that's how I got my early start in activism. And at first, I didn't know what was going on. And eventually, as I'm out in the streets and I'm noticing I'm at these big protests here in Los Angeles, 10,000 people, and I started noticing that sign after sign, speech after speech, rallying cry after rallying cry wasn't end the wars. It was spend less bombs, more healthcare. Less bombs, more education. So although there are very real anti-war activists on the left, the bulk of the anti-George Bush anti-war left was just about creating more socialized programs at home, slowing down the socialized bombing programs overseas and moving them back home. And I was very much disillusioned. And in a way, that was very helpful for me because as I was also listening to and reading Harry Browne, I learned that all these programs, whatever program it is, whether it's foreign policy or domestic, they either promise you something that never happens, or it comes in at such a higher price tag that it's almost unfeasible to even think about. And that's what I started learning working with the anti-war left. But there are still some people on the left that complain about spending. Now, Glenn Greenwald is one of those guys. He founded The Intercept. He was the guy who helped break the Edward Snowden leaks. He's been good on some things. He also was very anti-Hillary, not pro-Trump, but anti-Hillary. So he was pointing out to the left, like, if you want to beat this guy and you're a leftist, you got to come from the left, not from Hillary. So I respect someone who I can disagree with economically when they're honest like that. And I think Greenwald is a pretty honest guy on these types of issues. And he points out, and here's this tweet that came in the other day. So this was on Wednesday. Once again, the people who constantly propagate the vulgar myth that D.C. has so little bipartisanship and that the two parties agree on so little, sustain this falsehood only by purposely ignoring the huge number of major policies that the two parties unite to enact. And he's talking about the spending bill that just passed the Senate. It may be another record, somewhere around $700-800 billion, another spending bill. They've got like 8 more to go through this year. They voted 93-7. So Greenwald's talking about, hey, okay, the resistance, and he talks about in his tweets, he hammers on this so-called resistance as being a total sham, which it is in many cases. I think some people in the grassroots are real, but the establishment, the media that's covering it, and the people that represent it, Chuck Schumer isn't resisting anything. Resisting means trying to stop, and these guys want more government power. So they're just resisting Team A versus Team B. So it is a sham. And Greenwald is correct in pointing out that the idea that that there's very little bipartisanship, that they're always bickering, and they are bickering over surface garbage. They don't talk about the real issues. I mean, even the Kavanaugh hearings, instead of focusing on surveillance and war powers and the right to keep and bear arms and the 10th Amendment and the limits of power in the Constitution, they talk about more surface things. They talk about drama, soap opera stuff. And that is not what qualifies someone to be a Supreme Court justice or not. As we talked about, I covered Chris Ann Hall's article on this a couple of weeks ago. The only thing that they should be concerned about is he going to adhere to the original Constitution? I say absolutely not. But that isn't enough. These days, you have to have a soap opera in order to win or lose. And Julie Borowski, I don't know if you know her. I follow her on Twitter. She's a libertarian YouTuber. She's got a pretty widely viewed YouTube channel here. And she made a great tweet the other day. She says, you know, I can determine whether or not someone is guilty of sexual assault charges if they agree with me politically or not. And she's just being sarcastic, but that's basically the approach that people are taking. If you want Kavanaugh to win, you think he's innocent. If you want him to lose, you think he's a pig and he's guilty. And that's really shows the mindlessness, the 6-year-old mentality of so many people in the general public. But I don't want to rant on that for too long. Let's talk about this spending. So this was Greenwald retweeting a report from Washington Post, which is awful, but they came out with it first. $607 billion military budget by a vote of 93-7. EHP training is absolutely correct. The Constitution limits spending to the enumerated powers. 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 The Constitution limits spending to the enum But they don't care about that. And it just keeps getting worse. In other words, we don't have one team or another that's willing to follow the Constitution. They're not even willing. What's bad about the Republicans to me is all the talk, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more, all the talk when Obama was in office about the dangerous spending and Obamacare had to be stopped and government shutdowns. They were willing to do this and that. But when they're in charge, they just shift left. Let's take a look at this. Ted Cruz, who I've always thought was a big fraud. I don't like this guy. And I know a lot of constitutional people do. So if that offends you, sorry. I think Cruz is a fraud. He's the kind of guy that is opportune, that doesn't really, he talks a good game when it gets him places, but he throws it away as soon as it doesn't. And this is a great example. Alan West is another one of these people, in my opinion. So Ted Cruz, heading into a tough re-election, sides with GOP leaders on a big spending bill. Texas Senator Ted Cruz on Tuesday broke with Senate conservatives to support a government funding bill that provides a boost in defense spending, along with money for public broadcasting, Head Start programs, and the funding on an operation of Obamacare. Remember when Cruz was going to shut down the government over Obamacare? When there was no way he could do it. He could give a speech, he could filibuster, but he didn't have the votes with him. So he talked about shutting down the government over Obamacare, which technically he should have done. And he did. I think he made an effort, but there was no way he had the votes to go along with it. He did take a stand, and I actually made the case to some people at the time. They were saying, oh, well, there's no way he's going to do this. He doesn't have enough votes to actually shut down the government. And it wasn't technically a shutdown, but like less spending, which would be better. He doesn't have the votes, so this is just grandstanding. I said, well, maybe it is. But technically, even if he doesn't have the votes to go with him, he still should stand up and do what's right and point out that Obamacare shouldn't exist and they shouldn't be spending any money on it. I don't do what I do. And none of us talk about constitutional limits or liberty because the majority are with us. We talk about it because it's right. And whether there are enough people with us to enact it or not does not determine whether or not we speak the truth. So Cruz was all aboard trying to shut down Obamacare, defund the government over Obamacare when he didn't have the votes to do it. And we know Republicans in general passed bill after bill after bill to stop Obamacare in the House when they couldn't get it through the Senate and to the president. And then soon as they get control of the government, they can't pass a damn thing to stop Obamacare. It's still on the books. I know in some ways it's being dismantled and undermined, but it's still on the books. Much of the worst regulations still exist, and funding it is a real bad choice. So go back to Ted Cruz here. Just 2 months ago, Cruz boasted that he'd voted against Congress's then most recent major spending bill, which he said included the single biggest rebuilding of our military since Ronald Reagan, at the expense of a massive increase in non-defense spending. So at the time when he wasn't being challenged from the left, he's actually in a surprisingly tight re-election race against a Democrat who could actually beat him in Texas. He could lose. And before that happened, when he was going to coast to a re-election, he was willing to vote against a military budget because it was a trade-off. And personally, I think a lot of the military budgets are trade-off. These are not defense spending, but that, I think, is another show in and of itself. So a lot of the Republicans are very reticent. They're very much opposed to voting no on anything that funds the troops. You can't abandon our boys. I get the mentality. I don't agree with it, but they often will not do that. So the fact that he voted against it was a positive, because he's saying, look, even though I'm going to be one of the most pro-military guys out there, I want to fund them. I'm against this because it's a trade-off to fund all this other garbage that shouldn't exist. Now, the same situation happens, because this is primarily a military funding bill that he voted for on Tuesday. And the same scenario, and now he's on board with it. Plus, it funds Obamacare. Where his opposition, he made his mark as this Tea Party guy opposing Obamacare and the Obama administration. And Steve Smith says, kind of like the anti-war voices mysteriously went silent during the Obama years. I think those are two of the greatest examples. The left, the sham left, that was anti-war when I was marching with them in the streets. Like, I was part of that team. And I learned that they were a sham because soon as Obama came in, they were no longer in the streets. And vice versa. The anti-Obamacare right, soon as the Trump administration gets in, there's no more. Or very little of it. And even some of the leaders of that, like Ted Cruz, are now voting for spending that includes Obamacare funding. He should absolutely vote no. And I think that in and of itself is a real problem. So what he's doing is, in essence, he's shifting left. He's being challenged from the left. And so instead of actually holding firm to his principles, if he has any, I don't think so, instead of holding firm to the Constitution, which is his oath, it's his duty, he doesn't take an oath to... They take an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. They don't take an oath to preserve their re-election bid. They don't take an oath to continue funding bills, to not look bad to their opponents. They take an oath to the Constitution. Now, if the general public isn't on board with that, that's a different problem. The general public is not on board with that. But does that mean he has to sell out? I shouldn't be so hard on poor Ted, but he's bad. So Ron Paul's article, I think, was really good, covering this as well a little bit. Republicans share the blame for socialism's comeback. Socialism, like, we're getting people elected that and dash S, not just Bernie Sanders, but they're socialists. And here's an interesting stat, and this was Ron Paul's Monday column. According to a recent Reuters Ipsos survey, 70% of Americans, including 50% of Republicans, support Medicare for All, the latest incarnation of single-payer health care. It's coming, and it's going to be bad. The biggest expansion of Medicare since its creation, Part D prescription drug funding program. This was in the Bush era. This is the largest expansion of federal health care since the 1960s. It was passed by a Republican Congress, signed by a Republican president. And that's how Ron puts it. Occurred under a conservative president working with a conservative Congress. I think you can make the case that these aren't conservatives, but they certainly are Republicans. And he goes on to point out that the same dynamic at work in healthcare is at work in other areas. For example, the same conservative administration in Congress that created Medicare Part D also dramatically expanded federal control of education with No Child Left Behind, which of course led to Obama's race to the top, Common Core. So you have to reject these types of programs no matter who does them. You can't turn a blind eye to them. And I talked about that pretty extensively in two videos. On Wednesday's Good Morning Liberty, we talked about this from George Washington's farewell address. I also posted the short 2-minute video talking about this. Washington said this is what he called it, a usurpation. It's a usurpation. Basically doing things that the Constitution doesn't authorize without authorizing it through an amendment, just choosing to do it because of convenience or because you like the policy, you like the team in charge, you think the other team may have been worse. Washington called this usurpation, and he actually said, this may seem good for a short while, even in things that may give you a positive outcome. So some of the positive outcomes that we hear in excuse from people are, well, it's not Hillary. I'm happy with that. Or we need to fund the troops. I'm happy with this. So I know they had to fund. We can't let our boys down. They need a raise. So we have to fund Obamacare. So there's always an excuse, a short-term excuse that seems positive to somebody. And you're always going to find somebody who likes it for some reason, or large numbers of people. And Washington said this. Mind you, again, this was the first draft was written by James Madison, who was a great student of history. And in the farewell address, Washington's letter said, this is one of the ways that free governments are destroyed, through usurpation. So if you want changes, go through amendment process. The amendment process is not easy. That's why it's there. It's slow. Almost nothing would pass today. There's almost, in my view, there's like no chance of anything getting passed. But that's the point. Gridlock is good. They do less. We want these people to do less, not continue growing government just in order to get one thing passed or another. So Ron Paul is absolutely correct on that the Republicans are a big part of this return to socialism. We got to let go of this viewpoint. And I mean, I don't think anyone here has the viewpoint. I don't. That the choice is about Democrat or Republican instead of the Constitution and tyranny. You can't support people just because someone else is going to be worse, because the results have been really, really bad. We're talking $21 trillion in debt. This is absolutely unsustainable. Steve says they clearly illustrate that there's no difference between the two parties. It blows my mind that most people don't see that. And I think a lot of the conversation is on the surface. So you could even take the idea of Roe versus Wade, where I think there is some debate about what's going to happen. I don't really think the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh or not, is going to change anything because they're addicted to precedent. And in fact, Kavanaugh specifically talked about precedent. EHP training, our Constitution doesn't provide for a budget. That's a whole show right there. Thank you for mentioning that. So even on Roe versus Wade, they're not talking about the Constitution. They're talking about the Supreme Court making a decision one way or the other. So they're still addicted to the same philosophy that a single vote should make this determination of what's right and wrong for an entire country. And when it comes to these spending programs, Medicare, these budget bills, these spending bills, omnibus spending, the trillions in debt, the deficits, they're both on the same team, and they both keep doing the same thing, and it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. But that leads me to the comment of the week. This is a good one. We posted a meme a little while ago from my friend Tho Bishop. He does a lot of work for the Mises Institute. He writes there. I think he does some social media. He's officially part of Mises.org. And he says, nobody spends money more liberally than a Republican-controlled federal government. I think he's got it right. The full quote is ideas like, now this isn't the ignorant comment, I'll get to that in a moment. Ideas like fiscal responsibility and political decentralization makes for great rhetoric in a political minority, but are extremely inconvenient when in a position of political power. What makes this all the worse is that the GOP's fiscal irresponsibility will inevitably result in blowback for some of its better policy victories, such as last year's tax cuts. And Meharry talked about this in his article a bit, where he said, look, the deficits are bigger. They're running out of cash because of the tax cuts. Now, that's not saying that tax cuts are bad, but if you cut taxes and increase spending, it's going to make things crazy bad quicker. Now, maybe they want to set the stage for when the other team is in power and then they can blame them for the next economic crisis. Maybe there's some long-term strategy. I do like the idea of eliminating taxes to zero and cutting all the federal programs and maybe just running on some tariffs or something like that. Not tariffs that cover the current programs, but cutting to the Constitution, like this unrealistic goal that can't happen immediately. But we have to always hold to the right principle, even if we take small steps to get there. A great Jefferson letter to James Madison talked about this type of strategy. So anyways, the response to this article from Maximiliano Sanchez says the Republicans spend it for the good of the country, whereas Democrats spend it by putting it in their bank account without a paper trail, benefiting the self-serve. Yeah, that to me is the ignorant comment of the week, because if Republicans and Democrats together vote 93-7 to fund Obamacare, I don't know how that's for the good of the country. It certainly isn't for the good of the Constitution. And it certainly isn't just one side or the other ripping us off. It's both of them. Brian Hickman, I'm a bit late, but luckily I got back in time for the comment of the week. Yeah, that was a good one, man. There are a lot that I have to filter through, this one I've had I've got a weekly task to look at that says absurd comments in my task management. And this one, it says, I went through it. I'm like, oh, right. Well, we're going to talk about spending today. Brian, hopefully when you get a chance to watch the whole show, it ties in with the idea of the fact that we had a record level of spending by the federal government in August of this year, and then they just passed another massive spending bill that included funding for Obamacare. So really bad stuff. I hope you guys learned something. These reports I've never really watched the economy as closely as I have since Meharry started working for Schiff Gold. So that has really been a benefit to me. I'm learning a lot on this. I'm seeing more and more how, like Glenn Greenwald said, there is really a ton of bipartisanship when it comes to all the bad stuff. I hope you guys are learning stuff as well from this. And I hope you have a really, really good weekend. I'm very grateful for you spending some time with me today. The reminder, as always, smash that like button. I appreciate all the comments here in the live chat. Make sure, if you can, leave some comments on the archive video when it posts in the next hour or so. We'll also have videos up on BitChute and Reel.video sometime later today. We'll have links to that over at the 10th Amendment Center.blog. So 10th Amendment Center.com. Just hit the blog link and we post our videos over there as well. Again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a really, really good weekend. I'm going to get a little work in, but definitely going to get some relaxation in as well to recharge. And we'll be back here Monday, Wednesday, Friday next week, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Good morning, Liberty to you. Have a great weekend, and thank you so much for watching.